Hi everyone, my name is Ashley Jacobson. I'm a disability rights attorney and I have a master's degree in counseling and assessing the needs of people with disabilities. Somebody asked me the other day about the pros and cons of disclosing your disability in the workplace. That is a very important discussion, so I wanted to touch on that briefly here. The first step in deciding to disclose your disability in the workplace is raising your awareness about your own disability. Often those with disabilities are diagnosed and talked to about their disabilities, but they're not encouraged to really evaluate how they as an individual are affected by them. To successfully find a place for yourself in the workplace, you first have to research the general information about your disability, and then sit and think about specific situations you've been in that have been affected by your disability in positive or negative ways. You know your daily reality better than anyone else. Where have you thrived? What tasks are you good at? What social environments empowered you? It may help to keep a log of your day and times your disability symptoms lessened or became heightened. Another important question that you should ask when deciding to disclose is if your disability is visible or publicly known. Some disabilities are more immediately apparent than others. While passing as non-disabled is a privilege not afforded to some, it would be naive to not assess the visibility of your disability in deciding to disclose. Are there symptoms of your disability your employer can see? This could include limb differences, tremors, dexterity and motor skill differences, and a variety of other disability symptoms. Are there mobility aids or assistive technology devices you use in the workplace? This could include a wheelchair, a cane, weighted work tools, and many other things. Have you publicly discussed your disability on social media, blogs, newspapers, and elsewhere? If your employer has access to media that discloses your disability, you need to prepare with the assumption that disclosure may have already happened and come up with an approach to counter stigma, discrimination, and promote your abilities. The next question you should ask yourself is, am I financially prepared to disclose? And this answer should be informed by a few different things. You need to have knowledge of the stigmas faced by those with disabilities in the workplace. Unfortunately, disability discrimination is still a major problem in the United States and worldwide. You need to think about that in conjunction with the financial needs of your daily life. Can you afford to disclose your disability and risk losing the financial benefits of this job? If you gain or lose this job, will it affect government benefits that you might be on? Granted, if you face disability discrimination, there are ways that you can fight back legally and otherwise. But it's important to consider how disclosing your disability might affect your ability to be hired or to stay on the job. You also need to ask yourself, am I emotionally prepared to disclose? Whether the disclosure ends on a positive note, or makes you feel a little weird after, or uncomfortable, or you know it went poorly, you need to be emotionally prepared. Do you feel confident when you're practicing disclosing? Practice is so helpful. When you're practicing to yourself in the mirror, you can see what your mannerisms look like. You can videotape yourself to listen to the tone of your voice and your expressions. And you can also practice disclosing disability to your inner circle, people in your life who you really trust to give honest feedback. Maybe you need to just practice a little bit more so that you have some more confidence, and that's okay. Do you have a support system to emotionally support you in healthy ways if the disclosure goes well or poorly? The next thing you need to ask is, am I emotionally prepared to disclose? This is something that we don't talk about enough, but I see this a lot with my counseling clients. You don't know how your employer or your coworkers is going to respond to your disability. Hopefully someday we'll be in an inclusive world where disability discrimination doesn't happen every day, but we're not there yet. So your employer might be amazing about it. They might not feel one way or another about you having a disability, or you might be one of the unlucky ones who faces an employer who just doesn't get it. So you need to feel really confident going into deciding to disclose. One way that you can do that is by practicing. You need to practice to yourself in the mirror, on video, so that you can hear your tone of voice, you can look at your mannerisms, and you can also share that video with people in your inner circle to give honest feedback, in addition to practicing with people in your inner circle. The more you practice talking about your disability, the more confident and comfortable you'll be when you're in that kind of tense, anxious setting of talking to essentially a stranger about your private information. Do you have a support system to emotionally support you in healthy ways if the disclosure goes well or poorly? You also need to look at how you're doing emotionally right now. Does disclosing make you feel really overwhelmed? Feeling a little bit overwhelmed is completely understandable, but you also want to look at whether or not you have mental illness that could be positively or negatively affected by disclosing. Ideally, you want to plan your disclosure to happen at a time that works best for you and your employer. That includes a time that's best for you in your emotional state. Would it be better for you emotionally to schedule disclosing? Or, knowing yourself, is it better for you to prepare and then take the decision to disclose day by day? That last option is not usually recommended, but everyone is different. You also need to identify the best method to disclose. Can you confidently disclose your disability in an efficient manner through verbal communication? Now, the pros of the verbal communication option is you can evaluate your employer's emotional response or acceptance of your disclosure. It shows that you're confident and capable of discussing issues that maybe aren't the most approachable every day in the workplace. But the cons are that it still requires you to document how the conversation went afterwards so that you have a record of your disclosure and can utilize this if discrimination occurs. And also, just some people, based on disability or personality type, they don't feel as comfortable and they don't convey themselves in the best way verbally, as opposed to the other methods. So another method you can use is email communication. The pros for this is that it's great for documenting the disclosure, and the response from your employer will also be documented if they respond via email. And you can really prep the email and edit it to your liking. You could send it to your family members, get their input. You could send it to your friends and see what they think about how you wrote it. The cons, though, is that it's difficult to get a read on an employer's actual feelings from an emailed response. And you might have to have multiple emails to address accommodations and other issues surrounding disability. Now, a lot of people are working from home right now because of the pandemic. But pandemic or not, another method that you can use to disclose is plain old-fashioned telephone. So the pros for using a phone call to disclose your disability is that you might feel more comfortable speaking over the phone. You can have your notes in front of you, and you can also discern from your employer's tone how they feel. But the cons are it can be a little bit less personal, and some employers might prefer to talk in person or over email. Number 6 is really, really vital. If I decide to disclose, when should I do it? People will often ask me, should I disclose my disability in the interview, even in my cover letter, my resume? Should I disclose disability after I got the job or only after I felt out my new workplace a little bit, see how I think they're going to respond by getting to know them better? There is no one right answer for this, but there are some real pros and cons to each option. Let's say you are interviewing for a job, you don't have it yet. Should I disclose in the interview? The pros. If you disclose disability in the interview and then you're hired, you know your employer accepts you. You also don't have to stress about having that conversation in the future. You got it over with, now you can just jump right into this job. The cons are huge though, depending on the workplace. Disability discrimination is a major problem, like I've said before. Employment of the disabled is much lower than the general population. Again, not because most are incapable of working. In fact, most are capable of working, but because of disability discrimination. And this discrimination often happens with hiring decisions. So for that reason, a lot of people with disabilities decide to wait until after they get a job to disclose disability. Again, not saying that you should or it's recommended for you to do that, but I've personally used this method for myself. But again, there are real pros and cons to this. If you wait until after you get the job to disclose, employers know that it will look like discrimination if they hire you and then fire you right after you disclose having a disability. So you may actually have a better shot at keeping the job if you wait until after being hired to disclose. Now, that being said, if you have a disability that is visible by either the symptoms of your disability or it's visible because you've publicly discussed disability on social media or elsewhere, this might not be an option for you. If you have a visible disability for any of those reasons, you want to be prepared to discuss it in the interview. You don't have to talk about it in the interview, but if you go into the interview with a plan of attack, you'll feel more confident and comfortable discussing disability if it comes up. Now, the cons of waiting until after you get the job to disclose are that employers tend to have this false entitlement to knowing your private medical information, mainly your disability, before deciding to hire you, which is incredibly discriminatory and wrong. But sometimes employers will get annoyed that things were hidden from them, like a disability, until after you got the job. Now, of course, the fact that they're annoyed about this shows that they're still experiencing stigma against the disability population, but it's something to be prepared for nonetheless. This shouldn't deter you from doing what's best for you, but it is important to prepare. You also need to decide what time of day is best for you to disclose. You may want to wait until later in the morning once medications have kicked in. You might not want to wait until the end of the day if it'll make you overly anxious throughout the day. Or maybe your disability symptoms like pain are better or worse at certain times of the day. You also need to consider what time of day is best for your employer. If you're on the job, observe times your employer is more or less busy. If your employer is a morning person or not, how strict the employer's schedule is. And similarly, I would say to observe what mode of communication the employer prefers. Okay, we're almost done. Number 7, who should I trust with my disclosure? So sometimes people say, well, should I talk to my human resources department about this? Should I talk to my direct superior? How about the head of the company? Again, there is no one right answer, but you want to ask, does your employer have a human resources department? Some smaller businesses don't, but if they do, this might be the best route because they are trained in handling such disclosures, and they also have experience with things like reasonable accommodations in the workplace. Now, whether you talk to the Human Resources Department or not, it still might be advisable to disclose to your direct superior to help build rapport, show that you're good at communicating what's going on, and that you've got this under control and you're being proactive. But you want to make sure that no matter who you're disclosing to, that you're prioritizing your confidentiality in those discussions. Again, strangers on the street feel entitled to know your disability details if they see you walking around with a cane like I sometimes do. But you don't owe anybody a detailed explanation. Certainly, accommodations and other factors can come into play with how much you decide to share. But I talk to a lot of my clients about when they're in these situations, they feel compelled to justify their need for accommodations, to over explain to try to say, oh no, see, I deal with this every day and I still come into work every day and I still do a good job even with symptoms A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I would urge you to lean on the side of caution when talking details about your disability, just because discrimination is still such a pervasive issue. But you certainly have nothing to be ashamed of. Millions of Americans with disabilities are in the workplace. As time goes on, I'm hoping there will be many, many, many more. But whether you have a disability or not, you were hired for this job because you deserved it and you're qualified and capable of doing it. Remember that when you're in these discussions disclosing your disability. You shouldn't feel ashamed of your disability. You shouldn't feel a need to over-explain it. And you should feel confident that you're doing a good job and you're doing the best that you can with these circumstances in a widely ableist society. It also might help to talk to a coworker who you really trust to get his or her input on how to best approach a difficult conversation with your boss. You don't even need to tell them that it's related to a disability, although you certainly can. I've had really supportive coworkers who are great about supporting me emotionally and otherwise when I explained my physical disabilities. That can be really helpful. But again, keep in mind, every time you share about this, you're affecting confidentiality a little bit because you don't know who that person's going to tell. All right, lastly, the big question: am I going to disclose? Disclosing your disability is always, always, always your decision. However, if using reasonable accommodations in the workplace is something you want or need to do, you may be required to disclose that you have a disability to receive some of those accommodations. Now, some accommodations you can implement yourself, such as buying and using tools that you can use without needing employer approval. But some you will need the employer to pay for and approve, especially if it's an employer that's done certain things certain ways for a really long time, and you need to have a slightly different approach to account for your disability. So it's important for you to assess your accommodation needs, and if you need help with that, feel free to reach out to me. You also need to know your rights. Sometimes going into these discussions, it can give you extra confidence and strength to know that you have disability rights in this country that can provide methods of recourse if you were to face discrimination in the workplace. And then it's up to you. You get to decide if you disclose, you get to decide how you disclose, who you disclose to, when you disclose. But it's really vital that you think about all of these things that we've discussed before making that decision. So often I talk to people who entered disability disclosure conversations with zero preparation. And for most people, it can only benefit you to be prepared, to plan, to schedule, and to practice. And if you don't have anyone to practice with, or you just want to get my take on how you plan to disclose your disability in the workplace, feel free to contact me. You can message me, email me, whatever works best for you. I'm on Instagram at Ashley B. Jacobson. I'm on Twitter at Legally Abled, Ashley Jacobson on Facebook, and my general email is ashleyjacobsonjd@gmail.com. I hope this helps. If you have any other questions or concerns, feel free to reach out. Thanks, everyone.